Hi, I'm going to talk about user interface design side of web apps and give you an insight into some of the amazing things that can be done with pretty straightforward coding. These examples all come from the book and they're also available on the website, the URL, which gives you a whole load of different examples and samples to look at. So these all revolve around what I'd call liquid or responsive web design. That basically means that the web can work on any different screen size. It's something that is really important these days, and I guess the first thing we're going to just touch on is multi-column design. So if we're looking at designing something like a newspaper, then you may be saying, okay, let's set a column size and we'll give it a whole different set of number of columns depending on the width of the actual screen that the user's using. And I guess one example of a newspaper that has caught on with this is the Guardian newspaper, which does it pretty well. And I think we've got a couple of examples here which I can show you. If we go into Liquid Web, here we go. So here I've got a single column, just doing a few fancy things with some images here, and a Eiffel Tower. If I stretch this out, you will see that the Eiffel Tower is sticking to single width. If I go up, it's trying to map the number of puppies that it can into the space. And if I go higher up, you can see that it's changed the number of columns. And I think if we go full screen, well, on this computer, the most I can get out of that is 3 columns unless I shrink the web view, in which case, there we go. I've gone on to 4 columns. It's an automatic layout. Okay, so that's a pretty straightforward example. Let's see what else we have. Okay, the image carousel. So in order to do a good image carousel, you can do it yourself, but I've actually used Bootstrap to do this, and I've used a selection of little birdies. So let's have a look at my code running. Here's my carousel. If I click through this, I'm getting a series of birds. Bootstrap's quite a nice editor for this kind of thing. Provides some libraries and you can hack into those yourself. What about a thumbnail grid for linked images? Well, we can get that. Again, Bootstrap provide that technology. Let's have a look at their website and see what they've done for that. Here we go. Here's an example. Set of default images, and if we expand the screen, you can see, whoops, that it's changing the proportion as we go. Pretty straightforward piece of code. Which you can see here. Let's zoom in and have a look at that code. Switching between a grid and a list view is something that is pretty helpful, and you can do this within jQuery Mobile. There's a couple of different grid options, so if we're looking here, you can see a grid view, and and we might want to switch to the list view, which is shown down here. And I've written an example of that. Multi-row responsive grids. Let's click on it. Here you can see a grid view, and if I shrink down, that simply turns into a list view. So pretty straightforward. So I have a fancier piece of code here, which is again jQuery, and if we go into LifeX, we can see how this one switches from some nice good looking buttons. These jump into a whole bunch of locations which you can go through. And if I shrink this screen, you'll see it's turning into a list view. The interesting thing is this actually has 3 modes. So if I expand, you can see I've gone to these initial buttons, and then if I get really big, then I get another set here with a different layout. And I think that is a big contrast from the earlier version of that program, which was simply a very basic jQuery layout. So the main difference is that I've used a slightly better example library from the jQuery website. So what about a dynamic grid with pictures, a kind of Pinterest type thing? Well, this is pretty straightforward to do, but there's a great library that lets you do it, even simpler, freewall.js. And I've got an example of this which we can have a look at now. Let's just jump into it. Under demos, here we go. Okay, so I've used puppies because they're cute. Let's resize and see what happens. As you can see, we're getting very satisfactory resizing of those images. There's a number of options that are available. This is quite good because you can go for the addictive business of infinite scrolling with this kind of layout, and it works very well in real time. It's addictive because you always want to know what puppy's going to come next. Well, what about responsive video? Okay, so if you're going to use responsive video that is on somebody else's website, then you're going to need to use the iframe tag, which basically references or embeds somebody else's video. So that might be the case where you're using YouTube or perhaps Vimeo. If you're not, if you're going to actually run the video directly from your own page, then you can use the video tag. But let's look at the iframe one for a minute. So first off, here we go. We've got Gangnam Style video, looks good. Let's play them for a second. You can still cope with the music. But now look what happens when I zoom it down. We start to actually lose. Let's put them on pause for a second. We actually start to lose image. Now, one thing to note with this, I have enabled full screen, which is fun and that's worth noting about. And that's something you can do in iframe. Oh, I can't help it. So folks, let's just get this back under control for a minute. Escape full screen. And what I want to do here is show you what happens if I make this thing scalable. Go into iframe 2. Here we go. It's a different clip. I think this time it's Men in Black, but let's set it off and let's see if it scales.
We work for highly funded yet unofficial government agency. We'll take it from here.
Who the hell are you?
INS Division 6.
There is no Division 6.
Our mission is to monitor extraterrestrial activity on Earth.
Oh, sorry, getting a bit too into the movie. But there you can see it is scaling. And the trick behind the code in this instance is pretty straightforward. I do it in CSS. And what I basically do is I use parents and children within CSS. So first, I describe a box container that is the correct ratio for the movie. And second, I basically create a child element that forces itself to fit that frame, that container. And that's it. Very straightforward, but it's a really useful tool. Okay, page transitions. So I think the interesting thing about things like Snapchat, Instagram is that Pinterest to some extent, they have changed the interface. So instead of menus and clicks, we're into a much more mobile-friendly swipe universe. Of course, getting it so that it works well on multi-platforms is always a challenge, but it can be done. And particularly with swipe, you might want to add extra buttons and so on and so forth. If you detect, you can set your code up to detect a laptop. But let's just look at how I got swipe to work. There's a whole load of different ways of doing this, but the technique that I've used is neat because it actually allows you to So the swipe technique that I've used is nice because it actually, and swiping with my computer is a bit weird, but I can do it. What I'm actually doing is moving between divs, so effectively different web pages. Now there's a whole load of other techniques on the web for doing swipes, some of which are good, some of which are bad. I reckon I've got a really neat solution. I'm using very, very, very few lines of code. It's about 50 lines, and the important thing is that I am jumping you to different pages, so you can have whatever you like on the pages. That's a big improvement on some of the other techniques which rely on changing the background image, which I think gives you a more complicated solution. Parallax scrolling. So if we're looking at parallax scrolling, I have an example here. Other people's websites which are really quite nice. Let's load one up. Okay, here's a website with some pretty groovy parallax scrolling. As I go through, a whole load of stuff is going on, and I think some of it is interactive, so I can click on a few things. Yep, make the crowd run away, play a video. There's a lot here, but the important thing is it's all done in CSS and HTML, so it's not using Flash or anything like that. Let's just get rid of that. So I've made a piece of code now which will give us some parallax, and I did it in two versions. So if we look at Parallax 1 and Parallax 2, Parallax 1 first of all, this is simply scrolling text with a unmoving background, pretty straightforward. And if we go back to the menu, we can choose Parallax 2. And Parallax 2 is actually scrolling the background half the speed of the foreground. In this instance, it's actually going backwards, and interestingly, if you run this on your iPhone, it will scroll the correct direction. So my conclusion is that the scroll direction is reversed. So to get this to work on desktop correctly, I'll need to detect the desktop and make sure that it carries on running as intended when it's on the mobile device. So a couple of other really contemporary techniques are blur on scroll, or change opacity, or indeed zoom on scroll. So there's a few examples that you can look at that have been done by other people. Let's try some of these. Okay, here's a really nice example of a blur on scroll, and this is in CodePen. So if I scroll down, you'll see that the background blurs. Go up again, go down. So that's a very contemporary effect. Let's have a look at another. Okay, this one is going to apply parallax and zoom at the same time to a scroll. So let's run the demo. Okay, here we go. How about that? So it's zooming in and it's blurring. Nice little demo. And finally, another example in CodePen. Opacity on scroll. Changing the opacity. So I think in terms of scroll, you've got a number of contemporary techniques there. You've got the parallax, you've got the blur, and you've got the zoom. And collectively, those will give you really fantastic contemporary websites. Another technique that is used a lot in contemporary websites is the sticky menu bar. So here you'll see, if I scroll the website, bar is sticking. It's got the dreaded hamburger, so I don't want you to use that. But gives you a nice technique. It actually disappears after a certain point. Gives you more space. Let's have another example. This is in Bootstrap. Okay, in Bootstrap it's pretty straightforward. This is a fix example, and you can see again that the nav bar is fixed at the top as I scroll. When we're talking about user interface design, there are guidelines, but there's also, it's worth remembering, a fashion element to this. So we've moved from realism or skeuomorphism to much more flat design, which interestingly has been pioneered by Microsoft with their Metro interface. But both can work very well. There's a fun website which compares the two. We can bring this up. Here we go, the battle of flat versus realism. And interestingly, it gives us a nice parallax website as well. If we scroll down, whoa. Now, one point about user interface design is that the user should always know where they're going to go. We call that roadmap design. That's why the hamburger is such a bad idea. We need to make sure that the user is clicking on something because they know where it's going to take them. We've got questions with mobile of tabs versus buttons. Well, tabs are good on a laptop, but generally they can be pretty fiddly on a mobile device. So be careful. Nested menus, pretty bad as well. Golden rule, never more than 3 nested menus. I would actually say 2 is about right. Should you use icons or text? Well, jQuery has a load of really fantastic icons, and if we zoom in we can see a bunch of them, as do many of the other libraries. The issue is not everybody understands every icon, and so the rule of thumb here, the principle is use icons and text together. That gives you a much more accessible approach. Okay, so my favourite subject, the hamburger. Here's a bunch of hamburgers, and I'll say it once, I'll say it 1,000 times. Never use hamburgers. If you're using a hamburger, then you're doing a bad interface design. You can always find other ways of displaying routes for people, and the reason they're no good is because the user doesn't know where they're going to go when they click on a hamburger. What about scrolling and swiping? Well, this is an interesting question, and I've got a diagram here which helps with this question. Scrolling and swiping are often used together, and this kind of cruciform gives you some idea of what might be going on in the user's mind. If you're scrolling up and down, you can get scroll fatigue. You don't want to go too far. If you swipe left or right, people can actually do much more of that. If you've ever used something like Tinder or Snapchat, you'll be happy doing a lot of left and right swiping. The important thing is not to have too many swipes which then take you into nested scrolls. So this image on the right is showing you basically that the user's scrolling left from is scrolling to the right there, is swiping, sorry, and then going down into a nest. So that's bad practice. If you're going to have swipes and scrolls, have a bridge between them that is not too big. So you might be going left or right once or twice, down mainly. That will give you much happier users. Use of colours. Okay, so the most common type of colour blindness is red-green, so bear that in mind. That means that both colours show up as a similar kind of grey. 1 in 8 men and 1 in 200 women are colourblind in one form or another. The most recent version of iOS uses red a lot, and for highlighting uses it very badly. So here you can see a screenshot of my mobile phone playing Drake in iTunes, and you can see there's red all over the place. Doesn't make sense. Red is for danger in most cultures. So it's bad practice. They've done it because it looks good, but it's not good use, not good interface. Colours ought to be giving users a lot of points, a lot of information. And you can see some notes about colour here, which will hopefully give you some clues as to how you might be able to do this. So here you can see some of the meanings of colour in the West. So red is bad, stop, danger, aggression. White, clean, innocent. Cold, black, evil, ghostly. Yellow, happy, sunny, cheerful, etc. And if we're looking at readability with 2 colour combinations, this table helps dramatically with this. You can see where the combinations are good. There aren't that many which work well, in fact. So you can see, say you've got a green background, then you don't have many options for foreground. You've got blue and you've got black. This is a really useful table, so do bear it in mind when you're choosing colours. If you're doing accessible design, that is people with disability or visual impairment, etc., then it's a big ask and it's a big deal. Now, it is actually a legal requirement in some countries, and it may be a legal requirement soon in the UK to do this. The important thing about it is to make sure that you follow the standards and that you understand how to actually go about it in design terms. So I've put in quite a lot in my book on accessible design. It's an important process, and if you get it right, then you're going to have fantastic websites that work really well for everybody, not just people with disability. So which user interface libraries should you be using for your JavaScript? Well, I've mentioned Bootstrap, that is great. Interestingly, W3 Schools also has an interesting framework for built-in responsiveness, which is called w3.css, that just uses CSS without jQuery. Materialize, which is by students at Carnegie Mellon University, is pretty groovy. Uses Google's material design principles. Google has a web starter kit, which is quite interesting, and they also have Polymer, which is more advanced. I guess Google's Web Starter Kit is quite plain, but it's doing things in a clear and simple way. I would argue it's a sort of step on from jQuery, which has, in terms of interfaces, got a little bit jaded. I think the Google one gets a little bit too dry, but it does do the job pretty well, and the code is very straightforward. So the Google Liquid Quit demo that I've got here, you can have a look at. It's pretty straightforward. It's got the dreaded hamburger, so that needs to be fixed. It's got menus, and if we shrink down, the system's still working. Interestingly, you can click on there, or you can swipe left to right. Final thing to say about interface design is Polymer. Google has a big Polymer activity which creates these different components that are named after elements in a periodic table, and if we just zoom in we can have a look at what they have going on here. So Polymer, Google's Polymer is dealing with a whole number of elements. One is kind of core interface design, but then there's also components being built for push notifications, animation, special effects, and e-commerce elements. So these are gradually getting built up now. Not all of them have a great deal in place. So I think, for example, e-commerce elements are still in development, but it looks like this is going to be a very interesting set of tools. So you might want to look into that and keep an eye on developments. So I think I've pretty much covered all of the overview of interface design. Obviously we haven't gone into the code in detail, but you've got access to all of that, and we can touch on some of that at another time. I want to make sure that you can see a couple of other examples that we have here, so let me just open a couple in the meantime. So one element that might be quite interesting is what I'm browsing through at the moment is the list of different demo files. So how have I done that? Well, that's on here as well. So I've used PHP on the server to list directories. I've got two examples. One is called file list 1. If we run that, this is not particularly interesting one. It's simply listing all of the directories and files in the first layer of a directory. No recursive listing there. If I do file list 2, well, that is what we're already looking at. So that's recursively drilling down, and I've made it look a little bit more interesting. I've got a fixed bar up at the top, and I've used CSS to make the PHP information that's echoed look a bit nicer. So that's something to bear in mind. It's very easy to drag and drop, and that was one of the very early features of a browser. And remarkably few web apps actually make use of this, but just as a little reminder as to what you can do. Here's a screen which has got some birds on it and parrots and so on. Very easy to do this kind of thing. So something that you might be interested in doing, we'll just have a look at the actual underlying code. There's almost nothing at all to it. And you can use that for users to drag and drop for uploading or for drawing, creating new pictures and saving them, etc., etc. Okay, that's it on interface for now. We've run through most of the examples that I've created and a few examples that other people have put on the web. Lots for you to think about, and we'll catch up next time.